Hey guys, today we're going to go ahead and start a new chapter. It's chapter 3. It's ancient India and China. So on your notes, I would start a fresh page, go to the top of the next page, put chapter 3, ancient India, put section 1, so that'll help enumerate where we're at. On the screen right now, if you're wondering while people are writing that down, these are the terracotta warriors of China. There's an entire army of these life-size statues found in an emperor's tomb. And each statue had a different face because they all represented different warriors. Each statue even had its own weapons. All right, guys, so here we are, ancient India. When you look at India on the map, India has a specific type of geographical form. So, for example, right now I have North America up on the screen. What is North America? What is North America? If you said continent, you're correct. North America is a continent. What's Africa? Africa is also a continent. Africa, by the way, on the map that we most commonly use in classrooms, which is the Mercator scale map, is often undersized. In reality, Africa is massive. Africa, being a continent, not a country, has 50 plus nations inside of it. It is huge. But what India is, which I now have up on your screen, India is not quite big enough to be a continent, but it is larger than a peninsula. So like a peninsula, like what state in the United States is famously a peninsula? One of the nicest, it has some of the nicest climate, except when it's hurricane season, and that of course is Florida. So Florida is a peninsula, but it's not large enough to be this. This is what's called a subcontinent. Subcontinents are large land masses that jut out into bodies of water, usually an ocean. So you can see India right here on the map. Regarding India, India as a culture was kind of boxed in because they have the ocean beneath them, south of them, and you have like the Arabian Sea. But north of them, they have the Himalayan mountain range. So the Indian culture, the Indian people are, while you can go onto the ocean and you can get past the Himalayas, it's very difficult. So as a culture, they're pretty boxed in, and they become fairly self-sufficient as a people. And as a result, their culture becomes very concentrated. That's why, like, for example, if you were to go to India, you would immediately be able to recognize Indian dress, Indian architecture, Indian food. It is very much its own thing. And regarding the Himalayas, Himalayas, of course, are some of the tallest mountains in the world. What is the tallest mountain in the world that it seems like dozens of people go, and they pay $100,000 and more a year to scale? And that's Mount Everest. Mount Everest is so dangerous that even though people go up there with guides, people die yearly. So Himalaya is kind of, India, the subcontinent, is kind of boxed in there. Now, okay, so India's climate is critical in the development of the culture and the people, which is really the truth about everywhere. You know, if you're a people that live in a desert area, you have to adapt to that, and your whole civilization, your diet, your clothes, every part of your culture adapts. And the same thing is true with India and Pakistan, for that matter. And because there's a specific weather event that happens in India yearly, and that is the monsoon. Now, monsoons do not think to myself, oh, I know what a monsoon is, it's rain. When you look at that picture there and you see that guy with like that rickshaw and he's like drowning, you're like, well, that's a typical monsoon. That is a monsoon, but monsoons themselves are not rains. As you can see from my note, it's seasonal winds. Technically, what a monsoon is actually a reversal of the seasonal wind pattern. And so every year the winds shift and they reverse in India. And the thing about that is important to note is if the weather is really dry, like if it is really dry and the winds reverse, you get this brutal, hot, desiccating wind that will actually like kill the crops. But the actual opposite is true too. Like if it's super wet at that time of year and the monsoons come through, you get massive amounts of rain, which lead to flooding, which leads to death. And so like the Indian culture has shaped itself around these weather events. And so keep in mind, if you get rains too late, you've people starve to death because they don't get enough water for their crops. If too much water comes, then again you get flooding and massive amounts of people die. India itself, because of these large river systems like the Ganges, is very susceptible to flooding. And not just flooding, but something that we often don't think much about, and that's flash floods. And a flash flood, huge amounts of waters get released because of oftentimes because of a river or lake overspills its boundaries and it comes crushing down, crashing on people very quickly. So that's the monsoon. Now, regarding the formation of India, there are important people that come from probably southern Russia, and they are called the Aryans. And you've probably, if you're like a World War II buff, you've heard the name Aryan before. Hitler later in history makes a claim that the Nazis or the German people, the Third Reich, actually comes from Aryans. Hitler kind of states that the Aryans are like a blondish, large, white Nordic people. But in reality, Aryans were people from like southern Asia. And so actually this gentleman on the screen is an Aryan. They're smaller, darker folks. And the Aryans were herders. And the thing about herding, because we're a little removed from agriculture today, herders had to follow their animals. You're like, well, why? Wouldn't you just keep them penned up? You can't. Because you got to remember, if I'm herding like 1,000 sheep or whatnot, those sheep go out into the fields and they eat all the grass, and then what? Well, I have to go to another area. So herders, in a way, are nomadic. They have to move with their animals to get the animals the appropriate sustenance. And so the Aryans, over time, moved and they came into India. And the reason why these people really matter for history is they end up changing India's culture forever, because there's two major things that they bring into India. And one is the Vedas, and I'm going to cover that in the next slide. And then the other one is the caste system. And that both of these have huge impacts on India. Now, the first one I just talked about was the Vedas. The Vedas is a collection of hymns, religious teachings, and histories. If the Aryans don't bring the Vedas into India, we wouldn't know much about them as a people. And as a result, this tells us a lot about history. Something I've talked about over and over again is that if you don't write it down and everybody who's a part of your culture dies and is responsible for spreading your oral tradition, and they all die, then your culture is dead. And that's why written language, written expression is a huge game changer. When you write things down, things can move on to the next age. Your children and their grandchildren can learn from the mistakes that you've made, or learn about the histories and the great conquests and the great failures of your civilization. They can keep innovating because they can take your ideas and move them forward. That's a big thing. With the Vedas, we would know very little about the Aryans. Also, their religious teachings come into India and they have an impact as they start to spread and organically integrate into the other religious teachings in India at that time. Now, here's the big one, and it's called the caste system. The caste system is a way of organizing people into basically groups by occupation. And what you have to understand, because from an American perspective, this would seem different, because we don't have a caste system in the United States, we have a class system. So what are the differences? A caste system, and this is critical to understand, is something you are born into, and it is not mobile. You are there for life. There's some instances where you can lose your caste, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So for example, when you look at this, when you look at the pyramid I have up here, this goes over the 4 parts of the caste system. On the top of the caste system, you have the Brahmin, which are the priests, then you have the warrior class, then you have the merchant class, and then you have the commoners. And these are the 4 major groupings. Now beneath them, and the people would say who have almost lost their caste, they're separated, are what are called the untouchables. Those are the Dalits. So you are born into this. This determines who you can eat with, what you can eat, what type of jobs you can have, who you can marry. It dictates your entire life, and it's not something that you can effectuate. It is yours upon birth. So if you're in an upper caste, that's awesome for you. But if you're in a lower one, that's just your lot in life. And again, this was brought into India by the Aryans. Now this is a critical note, because this will now affect Indian history for the next 3,000 plus years. And the caste system stays in India legally till the year 1950, until they get a new constitution. And also, in a utilitarian way, there are parts of India that are still under the caste system, especially rural India. So let's just take a look at how this actually breaks down. So when we look at the top of the caste system, who's up there? Yeah, it's the Brahmins, right? The Brahmins are priests. If you put priests at the top of your society, what does that say about your society? Right, it would say that your society is religious. You have to appreciate that in many cultures, priests would not be at the top. Some cultures, you have a king or a queen. That's certainly the case in Europe. Many cultures, you have like a warrior caste or warrior class up there. But in India, it's the priests. So that actually tells you much about the culture. Without knowing anything else about India, whenever you look at the hierarchy of a culture, it tells you a great deal about the culture. It's an incredibly religious people. Now, when we look all the way at the bottom, I want to talk about what we have on the bottom. It's called the untouchables. The untouchables were pretty much outcasts in Indian society. Untouchables weren't even supposed to allow their shadows to touch another person, lest it make them unclean and they would lose their caste in the process. They couldn't eat with other people. They weren't even supposed to look upon other people. And the types of jobs they could have, like sanitation, cleaning a sewer, grave digger, rat catchers, things like that, people that deal with dead bodies, things that would be an unclean profession. That's what they would do for their lives. So again, this is brought into India by the Aryans, and it's really a way of breaking people up by occupation. Now, gentlemen, we could probably want to write section 2 with this. I'm going to go ahead and cover Hinduism and Buddhism. And we know the interesting thing about India is 2 of the world's 5 great religions developed there. So it's a facet, which again, if you think about the caste system from the previous slide, that really shouldn't surprise you because this is obviously a very religious people. Now, so let's talk about Hinduism first. Hinduism has, and you probably remember this from a reading objective, Hinduism has no founder, and that's kind of significant in history. There are lots of faiths in human history that have no founders, but they usually do not stay coherent. They usually kind of fall apart. Well, why is that? Let's think about it. If I was following a faith and one of the teachings became unclear and I didn't know what to do, what would I do? I would look back to whatever the founder did or said. If they didn't say anything, I would look at their actions. If they didn't have any discernible actions, like Mr. Rico's Catholic, I look at Jesus Christ, then I would look at the apostles or any of the disciples. That is what people do, and so if you had a question, you're Islamic, you would look at the teachings of Muhammad, any of his writings, or any of his followers' writings. That's what people do. When there's no founder, what usually happens with religions is they usually just explode because everyone starts doing whatever because it's hard for it to stay coherent. It's not the case with Hinduism. Hinduism is actually really interesting. It's a collection of teachings that organically came together over a long period of time, but it has stayed fairly coherent over time. And I mean, the main idea here is that it's really a way to liberate your soul from everyday existence. Well, what does that mean, Mr. Rico? The thing I've talked about in this class over and over is people in the ancient world had brutal lives. Think about something as little as this. Like, Mr. Rico, I'm picking at my cuticle and it gets infected. I put my finger in some peroxide. Maybe I'll take, if it really gets bad, this would be really gets bad, I would take an antibiotic or use a topical antibiotic. That doesn't exist in the ancient world. You pick at your finger, you get a staph infection, and it gets very infected, and the nail falls off, it gets red, starts to turn purple. You can't do anything. There's literally nothing you can do. Your skin starts to necrotize, it starts to turn black, it starts to rot, it starts to spread up your hand starts to necrotize, gangrene setting in, starts to smell like almonds. Your hand is literally rotting on you, all because you got a small infection. Consider something like appendicitis. Like appendicitis now, and this is crazy, appendicitis, most times when you get appendicitis now, you go to the hospital, they don't even take your appendix out. They treat it with antibiotics. And then if there's a repeat issue, they could take it out. But even when they take it out now, it's a tiny little slit, and it's outpatient surgery. Back then, appendicitis is a death sentence. You will die from it. But so the suffering of the ancient world is incredible, and it's hard for us in a modern sense to understand it. So when I say, okay, this is a religion that's trying to liberate people from this type of existence, it is a difficult life that in the modern sense, looking back, it's hard for us to understand. So what are the basic beliefs of Hinduism? One thing I would put, and I forgot to put it on the slide, and I think it'd be helpful for you, is the right that obviously the Hindu people are polytheistic. I mentioned that later coming up, but I think it'd be good now if you want to write down basic Hindu beliefs, put a polytheistic on there. The people who are Hindu believe in reincarnation. That's something like most students have heard of. You're familiar with it, right? Reincarnation is this idea that when I die, my soul will be reincarnated into another body. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean another, like, male. I could be a female, and I don't even have to necessarily be human. It just depends on the state of your soul. And the idea of you're going to reborn and you're going to keep going through this rebirth, this reincarnation process until you have a perfect understanding. And at that point, you've achieved what's called moksha. Moksha is the goal, really, of Hinduism, and you're purged of your selfish desires, and you basically no longer exist. You become one with the universe. You're gone. Now, I spoke to someone I know that's Hindi, and I asked them to give me a good way to explain this for my students. And, here was the example they gave. They said, look, think of reincarnation like a million candles lined up. And all the candles are out, they're not lit, but one candle is lit. That is your current life. When you die, the candle tips and it lights the next candle. When you die there, it lights the next candle. And I said, well, how does like moksha or, this end process fit into this? And he said, look, when you achieve this state, the candle's blown out. Now, from a Western conception, like for me, that's horrifying. I don't want to like not exist, but this is actually the goal of multiple Eastern faiths, is to become one with the universe. Your consciousness just becomes a part of that, and you're gone. So that's certainly different than a lot of Western ideas of, the ultimate afterlife achievement. So now I do want to talk about, and this is going to be in the next slide, about what dictates like what Mr. Rico might become in the next life. So we're going to go ahead and hit that now. Oh, write this down, by the way, on the bottom there for moksha. Release from the reincarnation cycle. Now, okay, so there's this concept karma. I know we've all at least heard of it, and some of us have used it, right? So on YouTube or TikTok, you'll see these videos. They're like Insta Karma videos. And like, oh, someone, Mr. Rico kicks his cat, then he like falls down a flight of stairs. Got him, right? I'm done. Got him. Karma, when looking at this within the religious practice, is usually more or less directed towards the next life. But it could also be this life. And the idea is that if I do good things, then in the next life, that will affect my health and wealth of, where I'll end up. And so, for example, if, say, Mr. Rico is a commoner in this current life, and I do my duty, and I accept it, and I live well, and I am more selfless than selfish, then in the next life, I would possibly move up. Maybe I'll be in the merchant class, or a warrior, or, in the priest class. Now, if Mr. Rico is not good, Mr. Rico is a violent person, and attacks his family regularly and cheats people at the local 7-Eleven. I constantly steal big gulps. I just got a thing for him. Now, if that happens, what would happen to me? Possibly I would lower down in the next life. I'd be born into maybe the untouchable. Like I'd lose my caste. I'm in the untouchable. I'm a Dalit. Or the other possibility is this, that I would be born and not be human. I might be an animal of some type. And so that is that reincarnation process, and that would keep continuing until, again, you've purged yourself of all these selfish desires, and that you would achieve moksha. Now, I'm about to cover a different faith, and that, of course, is Buddhism. Buddhism, I think in life, guys, when I'm trying to understand things, I think differences are hard to understand sometimes, but I'll be honest with you, what I struggle with more as a person are similarities, because similarities, they're easier to confuse. So the first thing I want to start with is the founder of Buddhism. Unlike Hinduism, Buddhism has what we would say is a founder, and that is, his name is, and you listen, is Siddhartha Gautama. So let's try that together in a moment. I'll repeat it one more time. Siddhartha Gautama. So on three, I want to hear you guys say it loud. I want your sub or whoever's in the room to hear it. 1, 2, 3. Siddhartha Gautama. Okay, so Siddhartha, and you probably remember this from your reading objective. Siddhartha is a man, he's born into privilege in India, and he's in a walled estate in a palace, and he lives a really good life until he's a young man, and then one day what happens, and I'm sure you remember parts of this, Siddhartha goes out into the world, and he sees an old man suffering, a dying man, and a dead man. And Siddhartha, having never seen this type of thing before, freaks out, right? And he has like an existential crisis. He's never really been in a situation where he's seen suffering, but now there it is. And so, what does Siddhartha do? He famously wanders the world, trying to understand what suffering is, where it comes from. And over time, Siddhartha becomes a renowned individual who people start to seek out wisdom from. Now, the thing I would tell you, and this will give you a bit of an idea of how Siddhartha, or as you've heard his name before, Buddha, is viewed. He's viewed much differently in the East than we kind of see him in the West. When you go to some of these vape shops or you walk past them, you'll often see a Buddha statue. And in the West, how does Buddha look? You've probably seen him. He looks like a bald, fat, Santa Claus, who's got this gigantic smile, and he's just got all these rolls, and he looks totally euphoric. But in the East, when you look at how Siddhartha is often depicted, like the picture I have up on the screen, Siddhartha is often viewed actually with serenity, calmness, wisdom, just in a state of peace. I think in the West, we kind of mix the idea of, okay, if he's peaceful, it means he's happy. If he's happy, he's jovial. If he's jovial, he's fat. I mean, there's a thing to that with Santa and things like that. Now, so let's get to this. Okay, so he believed that he understood over time, because he's wandering for 6 years, where suffering comes from, and then he has insight to, suffering that is valuable. And the people around Siddhartha also find what he's saying and doing very valuable, so they start to come to him. Now, the thing is, Buddha is not his name. What Buddha is a title. People start to refer to, instead of calling him Siddhartha or Mr. Gautama, they start calling him Enlightened One. Enlightened One, I have a question. Enlightened One, can you help me? Enlightened One translates to Buddha. So they're referring to him by this status, basically. And that's not an unheard of thing. You all know people who get called by certain statuses. That's incredibly common in society. Before I go to some of our society standards, in the Bible, there's a part where Jesus is talking in front of a large group of people, and they refer to him as Rabboni. Rabboni means master. They're just referring to him right as this title. But in our society, think of people who change status based on something that may have happened or the way people view them. And the examples I would give you is, one, we have these people that go to school for 8 years. College for 8 years. We start to call them doctor, right? Especially, oftentimes people get a PhD, but we won't refer to them as doctor. But if people go and get the PhD and then it's in medical school and they do 2 years of internship and then they're officially a medical doctor, we most certainly call them doctor, right? That's a title they've taken on. But there are other titles in our society. I took a title on many years ago, about a decade ago, and that's father. People get the title mother. Some people get Mr. Maybe you're working in the military and you call someone sir or ma'am. We give titles all the time, and they do reflect status. I'll give you an example. If Mr. Rico wanted to be a rapper, what you don't know about me is that on the weekends, I have a rockin' Spotify channel. But the problem I was finding is that nobody wanted my gangster rap albums because my name just wasn't working for me, Mike Rico. So I had to change it up, right? So there were some of the names I was playing with: Lil Teach, Da Rico, Loco Rico, Lil Rico, Baby Rico. But the purpose of this is this. Notice that with rappers, they take on a new name, right? Because when they take the name on, they're taking on like a new status, a new identity, and that's important, right? Because you don't want people to view you as you were, but as you are now, and it gives you more prestige in that. Now, so please excuse that question mark. This should just say Buddhism, Four Noble Truths. Okay, so what are the Four Noble Truths that Buddha basically comes to understand through this enlightenment process? So please write this down, and then I simplified them on the left there. So here are the four basic noble truths. One, there is suffering. It is something. It is real. It's not an illusion. Do not deny it. Don't pretend it's not there. You have to accept that there is suffering. Now the thing about suffering, the thing about anything, is that it begins with an acknowledgement. And I don't know if any of you have known anybody who's ever had an addiction issue. They've had to go get help for that, get intervention. The first thing at any addiction clinic or camp or place, the first thing they make you do is they make you admit you have a problem. If you cannot admit you have a problem, they'll just send you out because you can't do anything there. And the same thing is true with the Noble Truths. There is suffering. It is real. We can't deny this. This is happening. And two, suffering has an origin. Origin, of course, means a place. It comes from something. It has a beginning. Now, this is actually kind of leading to where this is going. If something has a beginning, that it only makes sense that it also has a end. And so this gets to Noble Truth 3. Suffering can cease. And to cease means to end. This can end. You don't have to suffer indefinitely. There is an end to suffering. It is possible to get there. And then that last, fourth Noble Truth is there's a path out. There's a path out. You can leave this. You don't need to suffer for your existence. Now, so let's, we're getting here close to the end of Buddhism. And with Buddhism, their ultimate state is called nirvana. Nirvana is similar to moksha. It's union with the universe, and it's a release from the cycle of rebirth, which of course is reincarnation. And this is the final goal for Buddhism. Similar, the one thing I would stress at this point too is recognize this: Buddhism doesn't have gods. It has saint-like figures. Like Buddha is really like a saint-like figure. They're called bodhisattva. They're like examples for how you should live your life, but there's no God in Buddhism. It is possible to have theological systems with no gods. These are often Eastern systems. They're called ethicalisms. They're sacred teachings that you follow. But, so just again, nirvana is the end state of Buddhism, and that final, and it's the final goal. You're released from the rebirth cycle. Now, okay, so final note with these, right? So Buddhism and Hinduism, what are the similarities? What are the differences? So similarities, both faiths are a search for a perfect understanding of the universe, search for understanding suffering. Both believe in reincarnation and karma for that matter, and also karma. They both have those tenets in their faith. Another thing I should have put on there is probably both start in India. Now, the difference is where things get more complex. Buddhism rejects the caste system that is in India. In Buddhism, if all people are equal, you cannot segregate people by these occupations and ways of life that only certain people can have at certain times. No, everybody's equal. There can be no caste system. Hinduism actually agrees with the caste system. It's very important to the Hindi faith. You're to accept your caste, your lot in life, and that will then dictate, what caste you'll be in the next life. The thing you have to understand about this, students, is that these cannot both maintain each other in the same place. Like one of these is for the structure of Indian society, the governmental and political system, because the caste system isn't just like a thought. It's the way their whole society is structured. So if Buddhism is going to stay, the caste system has to go. If Hinduism is going to stay, then the caste system has to stay. Well, what happens in India? The caste system stays, so Buddhism gets removed. Buddhism is pushed out of India, even though it's really its culture of origin. It gets pushed out, ends up going into Asia proper, into Southeast Asia. You see it spreading into China and Japan. It moves because it's in conflict with the culture. If you have a religion or some type of worldview that runs contrary to the political or governmental structure, there's going to be conflict. And Buddhism was running in conflict with it. So it's kind of an interesting thing. If you look on that note on the bottom, Buddhism spreads throughout Asia, but it mostly gets removed from India. Final note, um, Buddhism has no gods, whereas Hinduism, I've read some articles where people claim there's as many as like 30 million gods in Hinduism. There is a huge difference there between, how they view um, the afterlife and, you know, um, saintly and heavenly figures. Okay, guys, last section here, we're going to do section 4, ancient China. So section 4, ancient China. Okay, let's get to it. Okay, so China has a lot of similarities to India in that China is geographically segregated from much of the world. Now, that doesn't mean people can't go to other places, but it's very difficult. So, what does China have? China has an ocean. It's got the Pacific Ocean, the South China Sea. That kind of seals off part of the country. There are mountains, deserts. It's got the second largest desert in the world, the Gobi Desert, which is actually a growing desert through the desertification process that's happening. Deserts can grow over time. And China has two of the largest river systems in the world, the Huang and the Yangtze. And those two river systems, when you see these rivers today, they look like lakes. They are gigantic systems with tributaries and all these smaller rivers that shoot out from them. And because of that, China, like their connection, they have huge amounts of water, but they also get a lot of flooding. Now, similarly to the Middle East, and we talked about this with Egypt, and I swear this is the last time we're going to talk about mud, is that from the Anyang River, you get a specific type of silt that comes out of it, and that's called loess. And loess is this yellowish windblown silt that comes out of the river system, and it's often used as for crops and allowing for agricultural purposes. Now, that said, China has a unique topography which affects the type of crops that they can grow, and this is fairly common in Asia. Now, so let's talk about that. So what's the deal with China? China has innate environmental challenges. To be fair, everyone has environmental challenges, but when you recognize them, there was an old saying, it's changed a bit, it's that geography is destiny. Now I think they say demography is destiny. But here's the idea. The idea is the way that your civilization, the land is structured around, your people have to adapt to that, and that really affects your culture. And so, for example, the Huang River floods in massive ways. So, just at the beginning of last century, like Huang floods and like 1 million people died. Like that, a flood of that magnitude in the United States would be unthinkable. Think about the scale of death when that many people die. And in China, that's not uncommon at all. I mean, giant river systems are a huge blessing, but when they overfill their banks, that water just goes straight out. And actually, in that picture on there's a great example. Like when these water hit, they just cover whole villages. And to this day, China, because of its river system, have the largest dam in the world. And there's some studies that said if there was a problem with that dam, 100,000 people would die almost immediately if that dam broke. Now, here's one of the good things. Like, challenges are often your strengths are often your weaknesses. Your weaknesses are often your strengths, right? So for China, isolation is a problem, right? They're kind of sealed off. But the advantage to that is the Chinese people become incredibly self-sustaining. So because China has a hard time interacting with the outside world, they get everything that they need within their own borders. So, for example, China starts making arguably the best pottery in the world. China starts making the best clothing in the world. China's writing is very sophisticated and it's unified throughout. China starts working with chemical processes early, which is where you get gunpowder and fireworks and mines and early cannons and early guns, all of that because they become a self-sustaining culture. So again, they took that negative and turned it into a positive. And the last thing, and this is a really important concept for all of Asia, you know, um, I have students that they tell me, oh, I love, Chinese food or Japanese food, but they don't give any thought to why that food is the way it is. And so you have to appreciate this about large parts of Asia. In the United States, when we look around, we are agriculturally blessed in a way that is strange. Ohio, when it was way back when Ohio was being colonized, Ohio was mostly swampland. And so a lot of Ohio swamps had to be drained. But when you drain swamps, it leaves incredibly rich soil. And so Ohio, when you drive up like 75 or 71, you're going up, up to Columbus or Cleveland, and you look to your left and right, you literally see miles and miles and miles of farmland. And those are horizontal crops, right? It's just like wheat, it's like corn, and you don't think anything of it. That's just natural to you. That's not how large parts of the world look. That's just how we look here. Regarding in Asia, they don't have that. What they have in China, and the benefit to their society is they have lots of water and they have lots of people. And so they cannot utilize large areas of crops that go horizontally because only 10% of their land can be farmed. So what they do is they create vertical crops. And there is a specific crop in China that needs water and people, and that is rice. It's a calorically rich grain. And rice are often built up on paddies. They look like birthday cakes, and they come down. And they require a ton of water because the water runs down, and people have to then go pick it by hand. Well, China has both. And to be honest, Japan's in the exact same situation. Japan has islands. Islands that are very mountainous. So there's not going to be a lot of room to grow, 50 miles of wheat. That's not going to happen. So what they do instead is they grow rice, which is why in Asian countries rice is their main staple for getting a grain. Whereas in America, when you have all this flat land, which is amazing, which we take for granted, we grow things like wheat. Okay, so we're going to talk about China's dynasties. China has a dynasty, again, we've talked about it. It's really the first form of government. It's a ruling family, and China has that. China's first recorded dynasty, and what I mean by recorded, it's the dynasty where we first see that people wrote things down so we can confirm the dynasty, is the Shang dynasty. And so that dynasty, you have a king, and they only rule a small area. And that's actually pretty similarly to the way that Europe was laid out during the feudal system, and we'll cover that later in the Middle Ages. But the king only has a small area of control, and then he has people who are loyal to him outside that area. Now, okay, so regarding the Shang dynasty, they have an early capital city called Anyang. And Anyang, and we have, what's interesting about Anyang is we've learned a lot about it in the last just few hundred years. It was recorded, but until it was found, they didn't have as much information about it. They have found Anyang, and what they know about it is it's surrounded by earthen walls. It's so old, going back thousands and thousands of years. And the higher classes of Chinese society from the Shang dynasty, those families lived inside the walls, whereas the peasant classes lived outside the walls. As archaeologists have uncovered more from the city, we've learned quite a bit about Shang dynasty culture. And that, of course, comes from this thing called oracle bones, which I'll talk about in a minute. So, okay. So what do we know about Shang dynasty? What are the basic tenets of their culture? And we would start with their religion. In Chinese society, you would have what's called, it's basically ancestor worship. And you'd specifically worship the ancestors on your father's side. And much like with Catholics, you would pray to them. Now, how do we know any of this? And this is kind of interesting. We would know almost nothing except for these things called oracle bones, which was one of your reading objectives. An oracle bone is a turtle shell. And what's great about turtle shells is that over time, they'll actually remain. They won't necessarily deteriorate. What priests at that time would do is they would carve onto these turtle shells. They would carve histories. They would carve future predictions. They would carve things about the culture at that time, what was going on, prophecies, And what they would periodically do is they would take the turtle shells and they would throw them in a fire, and as they would heat up, if it cracked a certain way, then they could prophesize what the future was like. Well, okay, I don't know how their prophecies went, but what makes these turtle shells incredibly valuable, if they had done this on wood or parchment or paper, we would know nothing about the Shang dynasty. It would literally all be mythology, like King Arthur. But the good news is, since they carved it on a turtle shell, which will literally last thousands of years, people started to dig up these turtle shells, especially as Anyang was being excavated. And so now we can actually read about what Shang dynasty court life was like. We can see it. We can have an understanding of it. Now, it took time because the Chinese language was a bit different back then than it is in the modern sense, but they've been able to translate it, and we've learned a ton about an entire history and a people, all because of a turtle shell. And that just goes to show how important written language is. Without these scrolls and scrawlings on these shells, we would know very little about them. Oh, one last thing, and I put that note on there. There was an idea that the Shang dynasty may not even be real. It would kind of go down like a King Arthur, the Arthurian legends with the Knights of the Round Table, where maybe it's true, or maybe it's based on something that actually happened, but not sure, or maybe it's all fantasy. The Shang dynasty was viewed very similarly, but once these turtle shells started popping up, these oracle bones, then it was proven to be real. The value of written language can never be overstated by history. Now, I want to touch a little bit about Chinese writing. The Chinese wisely, early on in their history, kind of unified their country through a written language, and you can see it up on the screen right here. And you would have a symbol, and then you would modify it, and you'd get a different tense or expression for it. The awesome part about this is that the Chinese people did this so they could have a way of communicating from one part of their empire to the other. That is amazing, and that can't be overstated how important that is. I will say this. As a writing system, it is incredibly difficult to learn. As you can see, there are thousands of characters. English is no easy language in all its nuances with its grammar, but the alphanumeric character system is really flexible, and that part is fairly easy to learn, as opposed to having thousands of characters. There's a lot of the alphanumeric system is very flexible, but our grammar is incredibly hard. Almost the opposite here. Once you learn the system and you know how to draw the different tenses and things, then it's great. But it'd be quite a bit of work. But again, it allows the Chinese to communicate and be able to express themselves and to send written messages from one place to another. So we're going to go ahead and talk about what happens to the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty, over time, like all civilizations, collapses. And it collapses to another family. Remember, the Shang's a family, and the Zhou is a family that's going to replace it. Well, whenever you do something bad, at least I know when I do something bad, I always come up with an excuse, right? Oh, I got angry because of something you did. No, I got angry because I chose to. That's my choice. People love justifying their behavior. It makes them feel better. And to be honest, the reason why we justify behavior is it can get other people on our side when we're doing wrong things. In Chinese society, the Zhou come up with the ultimate justification, and it's called the mandate of heaven. And this actually has an impact on China today. What the mandate of heaven states is that if you're a really crummy leader and your family stinks, that the heavens will let us know by giving us bad crops, war, invasion, drought, plague, whatever. Things aren't going good. It's your fault. The heavens are telling us that. So what you would do is you'd basically start a campaign against them. Oh, we had a bad crop this year. You guys are terrible leaders. And so that's what this concept is called, the mandate of heaven. You want to overthrow them? You say the gods don't support you. You overthrow them. And then as soon as anything good happens after you've thrown them, you overthrow them. Like, oh, we're having a bountiful crop this year. That disease went away. We beat the foreign invaders. The gods are on our side. This is called the dynastic cycle in China, right? There's a dynasty, it gets stronger, it consolidates power, their art goes, they start to improve their art or literature, Oh, they start overtaxing their people. There start to be problems, corruption. Then someone's like, oh, the gods don't support you. And here comes the next family. Now, depending on the dynasty in China, it could last hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, or some last less than 100 years. It just depends how successful the dynasty is. So here's that. Here's a little bit more. So mandate of heaven. The Chinese use the mandate of heaven to explain what this is the dynastic cycle, right? The rising and the falling from one family to another. And there on the left, I put good, prosperity, peace, good governance. People are making good decisions, good leaders, good provincial heads of areas of the society. Everything's good. That means the gods support you. Does that actually mean the gods support you? The point, remember, this is a justification. Oh, I want to overthrow you. I noticed we had a flood in this province. Oh, we had a famine over here. Oh, there's a disease over in this village. We had an earthquake. That's clearly your fault. And this is what it goes on and on. I will say one of the big signs that your dynasty is coming close to an end is when you start overtaxing people. And this is something you can see from almost every civilization. We talked about it all the way back when we talked about Israel, when Solomon was taxing. And you see this a lot in Chinese history. You see this in European history, especially what you see with the Romans. When people start to become more inefficient and become more corrupt, they actually start to overtax their people. It puts more of a burden on them. They're less flexible. Then they have less give and take for when there's actual disasters. And that's when someone comes and swoops in and says, you're out of here, buddy. Gods don't support you anymore. Now, so just a little bit about the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou pretty much set up what we would call a feudal system. A feudal state, they would reward their supporters with like land. These are what we call like vassals in Europe, right? So if I'm the emperor, or if I'm the king, I have a small area of control. And then what I do is anyone who supports me or is willing to fight for me, I give them land. And they allow people to live on their land and farm for them. And those people might have to fight for them too. But whenever I need help, I gave you that land, you have to come to my help. And I give more and more people control of areas. And that way, as a king, I don't necessarily have a large standing army, but I have people who are willing to support me because their claims to their land are based on what I gave them. If you want to keep your land, you better fight, because if I fall, you're going to lose all claim to that area. This is called feudalism. Interesting thing about feudalism, I don't want to say it's a universal human institution, but it sprouted up in different parts of the planet that didn't necessarily always have contact with each other. It's this system, land granted for support. And we'll talk about this more when we get to Europe, and we'll famously talk about it with the samurai in Japan later. Now, so this is going to be where I'm going to hit one of the important people of Chinese history, and that's Confucius, and he lived during the Zhou dynasty. The big thing you have to appreciate about Chinese history is, America had the Civil War, and that was incredibly difficult, and it was very destructive, and even to this day, people talk about the losses in their family. But in parts of Chinese history, you could have half a dozen revolutions going on inside of areas of China at once. Revolution and different groups sprouting up to take control over the Chinese, what we would call China today, were very common. And so this man named Confucius really focuses on one thing that he thinks is important, and that is harmony in society. When you read when you read his works, he's really saying, hey, social order above all. We can't have anything if we're collapsing. And so the idea is to stay in your lane, or as The Rock might say, know your role, jabroni. You have to do what you do well. So if Confucius was talking to me, he would say, Mr. Rico, your job is to be a good teacher. Teach well, help your students understand. When you're at home, be a good father, be a good husband, be a good leader. But regarding whoever's in charge of the city you live in, now you have to be a good follower. The idea is that everybody has a role in society, and their job is to follow that position. Relationships are not equal by their nature. There is no equality. But if everyone does their part, then our society will be peaceful. And to this role, this is where in the East, in Asia, and I think you could really point to Confucius, which would be a form of an ethicalism, like a sacred teaching. In Asia, you get a lot more collectivistic societies where people are more tied to the group than they are to themselves. Americans, we pride ourselves on being rugged individuals and being individualistic. So this may sound different than your understanding of your connection to society. But in Asia, going way back to Confucius, this idea that we all have duties, we all have responsibilities. When we do these duties, we help the whole, which helps ourselves, right? And like there in Europe, in European philosophy, like when you look at Adam Smith later, he says, by helping myself, by doing what's best for me, I end up helping other people. In Asia, it's if I do what's best for other people, that helps me. And that's just an important concept, and that goes back to this guy Confucius. The last thing I would cover is this thing called filial piety. Filial piety is the idea, and it's respect for elders and parents, right? So you've seen movies, or you've seen Chinese culture or Asian culture where like if you ever watch a kung fu movie and these people are fighting, the most powerful kung fu master is usually the guy with the beard, right? He's older. In Western culture, we think of like strength with youth, but there's a real value to elderly people in China, and it really goes back to this idea of filial piety. You're to save the most respect for your parent and elders. There's really not a lot of old folks' homes in China or elder care facilities because it's really your job. And there's one last thing I want to say about filial piety, since we are molar. Filial piety is specifically about son to father. It really is. When you read it, it's really about, listen, when I have a son, my job as his father is to guide him and to take care of him all the days of his life. And then one day, when I'm too old, my son's job is to now take care of me. And that's the understanding. That is my duty and responsibility. And then one day I become my son's responsibility. And he will become his son's responsibility. It's this circle. I want to finish up just about here. We always want to end when we deal with these. This is short, but I could go on and on about Chinese society and their achievements. But if I have to pick a few, here are the ones I would pick. They invented paper, which is huge. When I talk about written expression mattering, like in Egypt, you had things like parchment. In Mesopotamia, they had clay. Creating paper requires planning and understanding of how to act with trees, and the Chinese are able to do that. And not only that, but not just the paper, but then actually bind it into a book where it can be held and collected together, which allows it to maintain its integrity over longer periods of time. That's huge. The Chinese came up with that. Another one is the secret to making silk. Now, I'm sure some of you have touched silk before. If you haven't, silk is awesome. It just has the most slippery, comfortable feel to it. If you look at pictures of what people in Mesopotamia were wearing at this time, it was really rough, like wool and cotton. But in China, they had silk because what they found is that these worms give off this tiny, super tiny thread. And that thread has a lot of strength, tensile strength, and it also just feels good. And what the Chinese figured out, like, what if we took hundreds of these threads and we wove them together? We could make one thread, and then that thread could eventually turn into yarn, and that yarn we could turn it into clothing. But you're like, well, where do we get all this? You don't have enough worms. I can't pull enough worms out of the trees by my house. Well, this is where the Chinese come up with a brilliant invention, and that is that they create mini houses for silkworms. And you see that on the screen right now. They have these boxes with all these different little homes for each worm, and they're encouraging the worms to make the threads, and then they collect the threads. They take care of the worms. They house them. They give them their needs. Then they extract the threads, turn them into yarn, turn the yarn into clothing, which becomes silk. And the Chinese hid silk for hundreds of years. People would come from all over to try to get into China to get silk. Emperors and kings from all over the world would want to get it, and they wouldn't tell people. They invented things like gunpowder too. The last thing too, just talking about their capacity for architecture, the major structure that we would associate with the Chinese culture, the ancient Chinese culture in particular, is the Great Wall of China. There's some thought, like when we think of the Great Wall of China, we think, oh, it's a big long wall. It really isn't. It's a series of walls broken up in different areas. And that's because the Chinese are terrified of one thing, and they are so scared of it. If you count up all the miles of the wall, it's really about 13,000 miles. You should consider what that means. The United States is only 3,000 miles across. So that's series, and these walls, it's not like a wall, like it's a 1-foot wall. These are often super thick, 10, 20 foot walls that go up way, way, way high, because the walls are actually meant to keep an army out. And the thing that they're afraid of are Mongols. And we will cover the Mongols, which are these horsebound folks. They're nomadic herders from Mongolia who scare the Chinese so much that their solution is to create one of the largest structures ever created by humans on the planet. And when you create something like of that size, that tells you what the level of fear is. Oh, speaking of fear. Anyhow, that does that. There's the Great Wall.